Welcome everyone to tonight's Johns Hopkins SAIS Global Risk Conference. Tonight we'll be having conversation on the geopolitics of energy with three esteemed experts and SAIS alumni. The Bologna Institute for Policy Research organizes 3 risk conferences a year, each dedicated to a specific area of global risk at the forefront of the public policy debate. The risk series was created alongside the Master of Arts in Global Risk degree, the major, a 13-month cohort-based program at SAIS Europe, which is now offered also online. The major prepares students to look at global challenges in a new way, training them to be a new kind of global leader, one who is able to predict, understand, and analyze risks in a rapidly changing and interconnected world. I'd also like to mention that one of our risk conferences is dedicated to Professor Robert Mundell, a Nobel Prize winner and former member of the Johns Hopkins SAIS Europe International Economics faculty, who passed away, unfortunately, earlier this month. My guess is that just about everybody tuning in this evening is familiar with Professor Mundell's work. He was a remarkable economist and a loyal friend of the SAIS Europe community. The conference has been made possible by generous support of Mr. James Anderson, known to many of you, SAIS Europe alumnus, and chair of our advisory council, as well as Johns Hopkins University trustee. I'd like now to introduce our moderator of the event, Professor Marco Dell'Aquila. Marco is a senior adjunct professor of energy resources and the environment at SAIS Europe. He's co-founder and chairman of Inspiratia and founder and chairman of Power Capital. Marco is an essential part of SAIS, having taught here since 2011 and as a member of the SAIS Europe Advisory Council. As chairman of Inspiratia and previously IJ Global, Marco has spent 25 years as an author and commentator on the evolution of energy and infrastructure markets, as well as regulation and emerging technologies to combat climate change. He has also advised on numerous energy transactions around the world, spanning virtually all forms of clean tech and renewables. In fact, the courses he teaches every year at SAIS Europe focuses on renewable energy and is a very popular course indeed. Marco has a BS in Civil and Structural Engineering from the University of Manchester, and of course holds an MA in International Relations and Economics from SAIS. So, Marco, floor is yours.
Mike, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's so nice to be here, albeit virtually, with you. I'm actually here in London. I hope to be in Bologna extremely soon. It's a pleasure to be here, I think, on our third iteration of the Major Energy Risk Panel. And the subject for this evening's discussion is going to be the geopolitics of energy. And for that, I have great pleasure introducing you to alumni. And I think most of you, I'm sure most of you, certainly my students who should be dialed in, will know about Martin and Sarah. Can I first introduce Sarah? Sarah Emerson is not only a world expert in geopolitics, but much more importantly, was in my year in Bologna and Washington. So we're very, very good friends. Sarah has spent her entire career in energy, and she is the principal of ESAI Energy and president of ESAI Analysis based in Boston. Sarah importantly developed a lot of the analytical forecasting tools and is especially famous for her work in the oil sector, but certainly not limited to the oil sector. Sarah is an expert witness in energy sector arbitration and litigation. She advises governments on energy security, and important for me, was a reader and commentator for the IPCC's 4th assessment report, which is very important. She's testified before Senate Energy Committee in the US, and Sarah is also a senior associate at the CSIS, as everyone knows, and a senior fellow at the Kennedy School at Harvard. Before coming to SAIS, Sarah studied her undergrad in Cornell. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you.
may I now introduce Martin. Martin, like me, is based in London and also a very good friend. Martin is today, quite recently, elevated to the vice chairman of S&P Global Platts. He is also a board member of the Indian rating agency CRISIL. And until maybe a month and a half ago, Martin was actually the president CEO of S&P Platts. So I can't think of anyone better to be able to comment on the geopolitics of energy. Before spending, I would say, the last 5 years at S&P Platts, Martin was at CME Group, Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and has spent the whole sort of earlier part of his career in commodities, having worked at investment banks such as Crédit Agricole, Dresdner, Kleinwort, and JP Morgan Chase. Martin is a member of the Financial Services Upper Tribunal, which is a tribunal that hears appeals against decisions made by the UK's financial regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority. In his past, Martin also chaired the London Gold Market, and Martin has an MBA from ESAI. He is, of course, alumnus at SAIS and has an undergrad in PPE from Balliol. So will tell us all about Boris Johnson and David Cameron in his spare moments. The format of our discussion is going to be very much a discussion between friends. That's how we framed it. And we're going to kick off with some questions. We'd love to receive questions from you all. So we'll probably start with maybe 20, 25, 30 minutes of three-way discussion, then opening discussions up to the floor. So may I start with the first question? We've had the recent election of President Biden in the US, and I'd like to ask you both, first Sarah and then Martin, what will the impact of President Biden be on the geopolitical arena in specifically the energy context?
That's a big question, Mark.
It's an easy. I start with easy ones and then get to the hard ones later.
Well, it's I think it's early to tell for sure. I mean, President Biden has certainly hinted. You know, he's a multilateralist. He wants to have collaboration with other countries in meeting threats or challenges overseas. I think, you know, if you look at the national security strategy, you know, certainly China and Russia come up as key rivals, especially China. And that some of the other issues in geopolitics are probably a little bit less important than that rivalry and the potential secondary Russian rivalry. So, you know, I think it's really hard to say at this point. I mean, I think one of the things that's happened is after 4 years of President Trump, there is a sense that American foreign policy is a little bit broken. And so this is a big task to sort of change that image and repair it if it is indeed broken. And I think we're at very early days. And I think from my perspective, President Biden seems to be promising a lot, but moving slowly on a number of areas. I mean, the one thing I will say is it does seem it's like he's got a good team in place, or trying to get a good team in place given the confirmation issues. But I think it's too early to tell. I think we're on a better path than we were a year ago. But I think it's a heavy lift.
Thank you, Sarah. Martin, do you want to make a sort of introductory point, then we can dive into the detail?
Sure. Well, I very much agree with Sarah's comments that it's early to tell. So let me reframe the question and say, you know, what will President Biden be thinking about in terms of the energy geopolitics at the moment? And I think he has a number of conflicting, potentially conflicting challenges. So if we start with the conventional hydrocarbons, there's obviously been a dramatic change under President Trump as to the US's role in the energy complex in oil and gas, right? The US has become a big exporter of oil and indeed of LNG and gas. And increasingly, that's been a political lever in a number of different ways, in terms both for good and as a potential challenge to certain countries. So President Biden, as we know, through the election, has made his personal commitment and the commitment of his administration to the energy transition clear. So the question is going to be, how does he square those two things in terms of the US's role internationally in the energy geopolitics of the existing world? Is he going to take steps, for example, to slow down US production of hydrocarbons or the potential production of hydrocarbons? And what impact would that have on the US's role in the world? Speak now, which is, how quickly and how dramatically will he really try and pursue the energy transition? And that has a whole new set of geopolitical challenges around it. So I think those are the things which are on his in-desk, let's say, and they're big questions, and there may be some incompatibilities between them.
Thanks, Martin. And Sarah, looking at those incompatibilities, if you are sort of measuring up, and it's never binary, but it's maybe good to see them on each side of the scales, his domestic agenda of reducing carbon intensiveness and the massive lobbying that he will face if he tries to do that, with his portrayal of being a good citizen and a respecter of international conventions on climate change. Looking at those two ends of the scale, how would you see that he can square the circle or balance the scales?
So, Mark, if I understand your question, you see a tension between, a U.S. role in climate
leadership
talks versus our role as energy exporter. Is that?
I don't see conflict, but I pose it as two sort of conflicting potential agenda items, and how would one go about dealing with the two? How would you prioritize the two? Which of those?
I don't think he's prioritized the latter at all. I don't think it really matters that whether we're an oil and gas producer, a big one, a small one, a big exporter, or a small exporter. I think the president has pretty clearly said, I want to see change in our global climate contribution, and that seems to be where he's going. And whether, along the way, if there are ways to, if you look at the, if you look at the permits on federal lands, or discussion of royalty payments, or discussion of potential carbon tax or other decarbonization measures, I don't think the president sees a conflict at all. I think he's on one track, not both.
And Martin, do you think there's any? Will he listen to his U.S. Traditional oil and gas producers to share, especially the marginal producers that have a higher cost of capital?
I obviously don't know what he's going to do. I think that his administration, I agree with Sarah, and having sort of been on video conference webinars with a number of the senior administration officials in the area, I think they're highly competent people. I think they're highly experienced, and they want to accelerate the climate, the energy transition debate. No question around that. How that hits the politics, both domestically and internationally, I think is going to be less clear going forward. U.S. oil and indeed gas production is very significantly in states like Pennsylvania, Texas, which are swing states. I mean, you can argue whether Texas is or not, but it's moving demographically in that direction. Pennsylvania obviously is. And we saw in the election campaign that when President or candidate Biden at that point, quote unquote, misspoke in one of the debates, I think it was, about phasing out oil and gas, oil production, he readjusted pretty quickly afterwards, right? So there are some real tensions. There are real tensions in terms of America's role in the world. If we think about the current and growing standoff with with Russia and the situation in Ukraine, I think there are a number of small countries which were formerly part of the Soviet Union, which are very happy that they have the potential to have LNG shipped to them if need be, right? On the other hand, that's shipping LNG halfway across the world is not really very energy efficient. So you know, these are just the realities of the energy geopolitics that we are talking about, and how those things get resolved in different environments, I think is an interesting and ongoing question.
And as we look internationally, maybe Sarah, can you maybe navigate and guide us through those areas and those countries where you see the sort of the wounds being barer and the conflicts maybe arising? Martin has made you know, reference to Ukraine, obviously. What other markets would you identify?
Oh, well, I mean, I think our relations with China, are we talking about US or just talking about general international?
US vis-a-vis its key relationships around the world.
I mean, obviously China is the key relationship, and that has, we're not sure exactly where that's going to go. It could, I don't think we're heading towards military conflict, but we could have a lot more economic conflict. And then Russia, of course, with Ukraine and other issues. And then, you know, there's always the Middle East. And I think that's continues to be a conundrum. You know, Marco, when we first finished SAIS, the geopolitics was all sort of through the lens of Westphalian nation states pursuing national interests and occasionally conflicting in military ways or making multilateral organizations. And when you look at energy, you know, whether it's OPEC or OPEC plus, or it's the International Energy Agency, or it's the UN Security Council, or there have been these groupings of nation states who have tried to manage energy. And what's happened in the last 20 years is that's the lens has shifted to these transnational identities, you know, tribalism, racial, religious affiliation that goes across borders. And those create threats that are much more complicated than just picking a bunch of countries. And, you know, some of it's migration and refugee issues. Obviously, some of it is globalization and shifting trade patterns and employment centers and all of that kind of stuff. And last year, it was the pandemic, which was a transnational event that I think as a planet, we didn't handle very well, because for some reason, our nation state toolkit doesn't work very well in handling some of these transnational threats. You know, the war on terror is probably what got us all thinking about this. So it's hard for me to sort of say there's one country or another country. I think there's a lot of issues. Trade is one with China. You know, sort of fear of influence, sphere of influence in, you know, South China Sea is another one, you know, sphere of influence with Russia is another one. You know, Venezuela, that's you know, another issue with, you know, what do we do with Venezuela and other governments like Maduro's government, who have sort of destroyed the energy sector. So, I mean, I think there's just a lot of issues that are sort of percolating up, and then China gets a lot of attention, but I think China is just one example of how dealing with certain countries on many, many, many fronts that are transnational in nature.
Were you surprised this week when China and the US announced the sort of almost pledge or agreement to cooperate on climate?
No, again, this is a president who negotiates. He likes to have meetings. He likes to get around a table and talk about things. I was more surprised by the Iranians coming out and saying that they were 60% along having a new JCPOA agreement. I mean, I think that was, again, probably written for the Iranian sort of domestic audience. But yeah, I just think this is, you know, we had this 4-year hiatus of no negotiation, no diplomacy, no getting together with other countries. And I think now we're going back to that, and it's going to take a little while to sort of dust off the cobwebs and see some sort of solution.
And I think, I mean, it's maybe worth sort of just talking that point through a little bit more, Mark. I mean, I rather agree with Sarah. I wasn't surprised either, but I think, you know, China has got a really high strategic interest in the energy transition and accelerating it, because its energy demands are its energy consumption is huge and growing, and it's a net importer of most of its its energy raw materials. So the faster the energy transition comes and the faster they can create their own energy in one way or another, the better. I mean, there's obviously a big question about how that transition comes and the role of coal over the intervening years in terms of production of electricity in China, and how they meet all those needs. But there's no question that strategically, if we can sort of jump forward, let's say 30 years, let's be optimistic that 30 years time, the world has transitioned. We're in our post hydrocarbon world. From an energy point of view, I don't know if you agree with this, Sarah, or not, but it seems to me that from an energy point of view, China will be in a better place at that point relative, for example, to the United States, which is quite heavily benefiting from the hydrocarbons world that we live in now. And indeed, as I say, as an exporter, is probably extending its influence at the moment. So there's alignment at the moment because, as Sarah says, the current president is a multilateralist and is philosophically committed to mitigating climate change, whereas the previous president was not, right? But from a short-term geopolitical perspective, the strategy of the previous president in energy was not irrational. You know, I'm not saying that he was right in terms of the climate change, but it was not irrational. And I think it's important from a US perspective, and I think it's important that one acknowledges that.
Absolutely. And talking more about the transition, which is clearly one of my areas of interest personally, and also a great area of interest to my students, a lot of youngsters. When we were chatting last week, sort of preparing for the debate, we talked about the timeline. And when I kind of posed the timeline, you were both shocked because I talked about a process that was happening today, tomorrow, and maybe living with students average age 23, 24, 25. It kind of feels like it's happening. But in reality, when you begin to look at the statistics, the oil dependency, the massive technology shifts and investments that have to be done, this is a long-term process. As SAIS alumni, how can you make students appreciate the time that needs to happen without kind of making them lose interest in passion and in the need to have this transition?
Oh, I can answer that. Whenever I talk to someone who's looking for a job or needs some sort of energy mentorship or something like this, I point out to them that until you understand the legacy fuels, the fossil fuels, and the size of that market, you're not going to understand the transition. So this is a great time to actually work in the fossil fuel industry. You're going to be in it for probably 10 years before you'll see a lot of really, significant change. But you can't really talk about charging stations or batteries or, sort of whether natural gas is a good bridge or a bad bridge to the future, and how fast you can scale up, wind and solar, until you understand the energy economy. And I encourage students, especially in their early 20s, you've got the passion, you've got the interest, you've got the foresight, but you need to understand the energy economy so that you can sort of see how do you change something that's so massive. And do it in a way, and just one more quick point on this is, the energy transition isn't just about energy, it's also about equity. And so you want to do it in a way where you don't grow the burden on marginalized communities, and you actually create opportunities and improvement in these communities. So this is not just we're going to get every car on the road is going to be electric or something. It's going to be, how do you make a transition that it's got sort of a human face to it as well.
I mean, the point about equitable transition, sorry, Martin, is a very interesting one. Maybe Martin, you want to kind of come in on that. It's often one of the points that's not discussed, because in our kind of rush to want to change quickly, we forget that, the costs of the transition are going to be significant. And there are those that can afford the transition, and there are those within rich and within emerging countries that can't. And that does create a sort of divides communities. Do you have comments on this, Martin?
Yes, I mean, I always say that I don't think you can look at the energy transition in isolation, because it's, I think, one of those uncomfortable facts, in my opinion, that there are competing goods here, good things, which is that the provision of energy around the world is directly responsible for raising people out of poverty, right? And in the last 30 years has been the greatest movement of people out of poverty in the history of mankind, right? Now, that's not, you know, that's just a fact, right? And obviously, particularly in countries like China and India. So what has that meant? What that meant, it has meant that is that demand for energy across the world, particularly in countries like India and China, has gone up really, really significantly and dramatically over the last 20 or 30 years. So it's not that it's happened for some random reason, right? Or that because there are a bunch of people who are just being, you know, really forgetting to switch the lights off when they go out or whatever it is. It's because actually people are being lifted out of poverty. And call me over old-fashioned, but I think that that's rather important, right? So what, and so the, you know, if we look forward the next 20 years, what people tend to forget in this whole discussion about the energy transition is that demand is likely for energy is likely to continue to go up significantly over the next 20 or 30 years. And to be honest, we should hope that it goes up, right? Because what's the numbers? Sarah's probably got the numbers. I think it's about 1.5 billion people around the world who do not have access to basic energy needs in their daily life, right? So we want to provide energy to them. So the big challenge is that the energy demand for energy is going up. And you know, people like Sarah and me have been involved in talks around the energy transition for what, Sarah, probably the last 20 years, I would say. And the percentage of renewables in the energy mix, the percentage of renewables in the energy mix is exactly the same now as it was 20 years ago, exactly the same percentage. So in absolute numbers, it's higher. So we have made progress, so that's good. But the percentage is the same because demand continues to go up. So the challenge is, well, how can we accelerate that transition while continuing to accommodate growth of demand? And that's a really hard challenge. And I just think that one has to acknowledge that it's a hard challenge, but it's absolutely the best thing that any young student can be working on, right? What better could you be working on? The provision of energy for people who are the neediest in the world, combined with moving out of mitigating a climate disaster. I mean, that combination is compelling, but one has to acknowledge the nature of the challenge, I think.
Yeah, I fully agree, Martin. Well said.
But let's get slightly specific, and then we can move back to more strategic. I probably could hear my students, and hopefully they're asking questions, say, well, you know, you've talked to us about carbon capture and storage, and yes, that is using existing technology, enhancing the technology and mitigating climate change. But isn't that just putting a band-aid on a problem? Shouldn't we just be shutting these old power stations down? To be very specific, there are lots of other analogies. You could extend the analogy to old nuclear plants as well. What is the rationale for finding and investing in technological solutions which persist our dependence? Or am I framing this in an excessively negative perspective?
I don't, maybe this is what you're, maybe this is related to what you're saying, but cost of capital, right? So what's most interesting is there's what governments do, and then there's what private sector does. And right now, I feel like the financial community is sort of coming in and sort of saying, look, we're going to invest in companies that move the needle. And those companies are going to generally, along the way, be able to offer a lower cost of capital to those kinds of companies. And that's going to be an incentive for companies to sort of make changes, to invest in things like carbon capture, reforestation, any kind of, additional biofuels, It certainly helps with some of the mandates for renewable energy and things like that. So, I kind of feel like there's a top-down government push that would be mandated mandates and carbon taxes and things like that. And then there's a bottom-up push that I think is being led predominantly by the financial community and some of the bigger energy companies, of course, and then some of the bigger companies that use energy. And so we have these sort of two forces happening at the same time. And right now it feels like the bottom up may be having a bigger short-term impact than the sort of top-down sort of government approach.
Or it could be that the government approach has been very successful and has woken the giant, and now, it's done its job, which was to, make the corporate private sector take this issue seriously. And now it can do so without needing to provide any more, feed-in tariffs, for example, fixed commitments for government for 20 years, because the corporate is willing to sign up to that long-term PPA as a specific example. But all these are interesting transitional issues. Will this transition affect geopolitics? That's the question. How will it affect? Or is this, again, my first question, not something fast, but maybe for the next generation? Because we're still sort of 90% consumption conventional sources of energy, and therefore the needle hasn't been moved.
It's totally a question for us, and I think it's a super relevant question, Marco, because I think that the big question for us now, we do not have all the answers, I believe, as a society as to how we're going to meet those twin goals of continuing to satisfy growing energy demand and mitigating climate change at the same time. We don't have this is the path solution, right? But this is something which plays out over, the next 30, 40 years. So, you mentioned carbon capture and storage. Personally, I think, the more one could do now, the better, because it buys us time, right? I mean, let's hope you're old enough to remember, Marco. I can remember when the first fax machine appeared in our office, and it felt like it was some sort of wonder machine. And and I would imagine that a lot of your students on this call probably have never seen a fax machine, because it's such antiquated technology now, right?
They're Googling to find out what the hell a fax machine is.
So that's only 30 odd years ago, right? So let's hope that carbon and capture technology is sort of like the fax machine, right? Which is, it serves its purpose for a period of time, but in 30 years' time, your students on this call will look back at that and say, can you believe we had to do that stuff because we hadn't figured this out, right? So I think one's got to go along the path, right? And the current path, in my view, or some of the things which we can do on the current path, are to utilize existing hydrocarbons in the most carbon efficient way possible, and to take action to reduce the carbon footprint of existing hydrocarbons. And that has some very significant geopolitical consequences in my viewpoint. If you just talk about things that some people are starting to look at now, things like the carbon footprint or the carbon density of different productions of crude oil around the world, right? That has, if we start to price carbon in crude oil production, that's going to have some really significant consequences in terms of which countries are producing more crude oil, like, for example, in Saudi, and which countries would be producing less crude oil, for example, in Russia or Mexico, or probably in parts of Canada. So these things, so these two issues become interrelated. So they're immensely complicated, but absolutely the path we take to the energy transition will have geopolitical consequences. No question about that, in my view. I don't know, Sarah, whether you agree with that.
I do, but I think of it as it's one and the same. So climate is now is geopolitics.
Yeah.
And we've talked before about the role of pipeline diplomacy. We're here at SAIS Europe, or at least virtually at SAIS Europe. In Italy, Italy is relied on as a kind of microcosmic example of relied on imports of natural gas essentially to power the country more than to achieve the transition. I mean, it really has been the mainstay of the economy after the early 70s, when we had to go cap in hand to the IMF to get bailed out when we couldn't afford the oil. And Germany has also been reliant on pipelines. Do you see pipeline gas as being, you know, an integral part of the future? We had Marco Alverà, the CEO of Snam, who owns a lot of pipelines, especially in Italy, come to teach our class last week, and very insightful comments. And he said, he was speaking actually specifically about hydrogen, but he said that the role of pipelines is absolutely critical, and he saw that role continuing if we transition towards a sort of hydrogen economy that, in a sense, prolongs the infrastructure because you're able to reutilize that. Do you agree with that view, or do you think he was just kind of promoting his own corporate interests?
Well, you know, oh, sorry, Martin, were you going to say something?
Go ahead, sir.
So, you know, I'm sure you've heard the old saying, liquids are global, gas is continental, and wires are local.
Yeah.
So I think as long as you have continental gas transmission pipelines, you know, you're going to have these opportunities to reuse or repurpose some of them for hydrogen. But I'm not convinced that hydrogen is going to jump so fast that it'll be at a scale where it would knock out natural gas. I see it as sort of a, you know, it's got a lot of promise, but I don't. It's in such a smaller scale. I'm not sure how it. I mean, obviously the infrastructure is important, but it's on such a smaller scale than natural gas by pipe. So I'm not really sure what to do with that.
So it's more of a longer term, kick the can down the road and maybe blend a bit of hydrogen and see how that works, and then maybe transition more fully in 20, 30 years.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think hydrogen is definitely a piece of the puzzle for sure. But, you know, wait till there's a hydrogen explosion somewhere and someone says, oh, well, wait a second here. Do we have all the safety regulations we need? And, you know, it's like everything else. You know, you have ruptures in any kind of pipeline. So, you know, and hydrogen is still, you know, we're still developing it from fossil fuels. You know, when you get to green hydrogen, that's a different story. So to me, it's just it's an add-on to the natural gas wave until it can be made from renewables.
And even then, it can still use the pipes.
You can still use the pipes. Yeah. So yeah.
So the incumbents aren't upset then.
Yeah, I mean, I see we're having a hard enough time trying to get charging stations places, you know, trying to figure out which pipe is going to carry which hydrogen is maybe a little tricky.
And what's your view, Martin?
I very much agree with Sarah about hydrogen. I think Marco's a big advocate for hydrogen, and it's certainly the last couple of years. I mean, that if it's your impression as well, Sarah, I think in this, when we talk about the energy transition, we seem to go in you know, every 2 or 3 years, we focus on a different technology or a different quote unquote solution. And at the moment, hydrogen is certainly very topical, but I agree, sort of remains to be proven, and the economics remain to be proven. I do think that pipeline politics is going to be an increasing feature of the next 20 or 30 years, irrespective whether gas pipeline, hydrogen pipelines, or a mixture of both. I remember when I was at SAIS, there was a lot of discussion about the pipeline politics between Europe and the Soviet Union at the time, and the US having some concerns about that. And I didn't really understand at the time what that debate was about. But lo and behold, here we are, and we're still concerned, even more concerned about pipeline politics between Russia and Europe. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. I think it's important to note that Russia now has gas pipelines which go to China, and that's a relatively new development. So Russia has more flexibility in its pipeline system and its export markets, and that gives it more geostrategic flexibility in terms of its relationship with Europe than maybe it did historically. And we've already mentioned LNG, and LNG obviously gives some flexibility in terms of going around, if you like, the pipeline politics. And of course, there's been pipeline politics in the US in terms of oil pipelines. So that network and the growing network of pipelines around the world just seems to bring a lot of noise with it. Right? maybe because it's visible, but infrastructure counts. Infrastructure gives flexibility. If you look at the US exporting LNG out of terminals which were originally designed to import LNG, not to export. So I think that increasing infrastructure of pipelines around the world is important.
Sarah, if you don't have another comment, I thought I'd maybe turn to some of the questions we've had since we've been speaking for about 45, and then there are a couple of questions, and then maybe we can go back to our discussion. So hopefully not out of context, but a question here from David Scull. Both the US and Canada have a number of second wave LNG export projects that are stalled. Do you see these projects ever being funded or built? And if not, how will they impact upstream North American gas producers?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, you have to look at the demand for LNG elsewhere. And Qatar is obviously increasing its LNG capabilities as well as other countries. And, if Iran were ever out from under sanctions, Iran could too. And the Saudis have. So, the LNG terminals that are sort of in the queue, but not moving forward in the US, and I assume they're talking about Western Canada, I think you have to look at them not in terms of whether they should be built, but whether there's demand for the fuel that's going to come out of them. And I think that's one of the issues. And, what are we at, 10 BCFD now of exports, or 12 or something like that from the United States? Mm-hmm. And, could you double that? I mean, we've got enough projects in the pipeline to more than triple that probably, but that doesn't mean they all get built. Uneconomic projects don't get built. So it's not just a case of local permitting, it's also a case of, is there enough market out there for this? That's my sense of it. So possibly not.
Okay. And Martin, do you have a sort of view? Or?
Yeah, I don't disagree with Sarah. I think the other thing that's probably worth mentioning is that the whole provision of capital to the US oil and gas sector is really up in the air at the moment, right? So, if one looks at the massive growth of the sector, both in oil and gas, and they're obviously interrelated, a lot of that has come from partnerships and private equity backed businesses over the last decade, and there's been this mad dash to produce, but return on capital has generally been quite poor, and now we've seen in particularly last year, a number of bankruptcies, and so I think there's much less. The access to capital is going to be harder, and I think that very much underlines Sarah's comments. It's going to be harder, I think, in the private equity world because the returns haven't been there. But I think it's probably going to be harder in the majors world as well. And obviously, we've seen some consolidation in the US in terms of the E&P sectors, because I think the majors are going to get the squeeze from the big banks, because the big banks now, there's the push for the big banks to reduce their lending to the hydrocarbon sector is clearly there. So I think that not every project is going to get funded.
Marco, that's a great point, Martin. And Marco, I would say, I think the environmental community sends a very mixed signal on natural gas.
Yeah.
And, on one hand, it's potentially the bridge to the renewable world. On the other hand, it's a fossil fuel, so it's bad. So let's just jump over it right to renewables. And I think right now, one of the things that has to happen, and again, this is where I think we don't handle these big transnational threats very well, is thinking about what is the role of natural gas going forward. And I don't mean next year, I mean the next 20, 30 years. It's going to have a role, but we're having a hard time defining exactly what that is, because there are folks who sort of look at natural gas and say, oh, that's a fracking output. Oh, that must be bad. And then, we want to make hydrogen, but we don't really want to make that. We want to make green hydrogen, and so it's very hard to sort of say how these LNG projects, these newer LNG projects that are sort of North America focused, that sort of are a long way from market, how they can, excel if it's uncertain as to whether natural gas is going to be a fuel of the future or not.
Yeah, I agree. And if I can add my 2 cents worth, I would say that from a funding strategy, in the past, these projects were mostly project finance with long-term contracts. We're probably moving towards a more merchant-based market. I mean, that's sort of synthesis. Somebody's going to have to take some more risks, because long-term contracts are not going to be available, not like the ones we've seen before. And that, what's that going to do? Well, it's going to stop certain projects, but certain projects are going to go ahead. There'll be fundamentals to think about, and investors are going to have to, stop relying on contracted cash flow and actually start to analyze the market and understand the commodity they're investing in. And I would say that that's probably a good thing. I'd like to change tack now, and I have a different question from Joe Umola, who is one of the students in my class, and he has a question on geopolitics. How do you envisage the EU balancing its renewable energy vision in its Green New Deal and reconciling the dependencies on Russian gas? Specifically, as Russia continues to ratchet up its security rhetoric, is there a possibility that Russia capitalizes on its pipeline infrastructure to convert to hydrogen? That's a long question. Martin,
it's a great question.
Yeah. Shall I give him an A for that then?
I think it's an A for a question, because I think it's one which every EU policymaker who's involved in this field is and should be waking up every morning and thinking about, right? Because I think the hydrogen piece at the end we probably dealt with in the overall hydrogen comments, but I think that it is a balance, right, between the renewable energy vision and the dependency on Russian gas, and Russian gas is an absolute key and critical part of the European energy system, and that reliance ain't going away for the foreseeable future. So you can again, if we can jump forward 30 years, there are all these things which people talk about in terms of having, a bunch of, you probably got much more knowledge about this, Marco, than I have, but having sort of solar panels all across the northern Sahara and
the new desert tech,
and underground cables to cross into the European grid system, and then we won't need Russian gas in 30 or 40 years' time. I mean, you would know better than me how feasible that is from a technology perspective, but you can imagine these sort of things happening. But in the meantime, there's a heavy dependency on Russian gas. So those are just the realities of the situation. So I'm not sure that it's an either or. I think that the EU, to its credit, has been absolutely in the forefront of setting standards globally, really, in terms of how to move forward with the energy transition. And I think we'll continue to do so, but we'll continue to do so while continuing to be heavily reliant on Russian gas for probably some decades to come.
I agree. Sarah?
I don't really have anything to add to that. It was a brilliant
I would add a little about sort of the economics of North African electricity, solar electricity. I mean, generally, it's cheaper to transport gas than it is to transport electricity. So, Desertec failed for a reason. It wasn't to do with the efficiency of the solar panels, or was it to do with the sand breaking the technology? It was to do with basic economics. Back to the gas pipeline point. It's easier cheaper to transport, and it always will be. I remember when we were at SAIS, there was an energy class, one energy class, and it was taught by Professor Gianni Bonvicini. You probably don't remember. I don't know if you took the class. And I actually did a paper for him on Russian gas exports. So I remember finding it before throwing it away. I just looked at the conclusion, and I did say all those years ago, 86, that Russian gas is here to stay, and it'll probably be here for our kids. So, given my daughter's now 20, my guesses were probably about right. I just felt it was kind of the permanent infrastructure that would underpin kind of our economic wealth, certainly in Europe. I should add a little side story that many years later, I was reading the Sole or Corriere della Sera, and I read that this professor, Gianni Bonvicini, had been arrested for having been a Romanian spy. But that's just a side story. Interesting little question. I have another question. And this question, give me a second. I did find it. It's gone again. Where is the question? It was from Pablo. Pablo, where did you put the question?
While you're looking for it, Marco, maybe I could just make a quick comment on your interesting points about the solar city in the Sahara, because I think it sounded like you thought the technology was possible, but the price wasn't right. And you know that sort of raises one of the other interesting questions, which is how much are we willing to pay for the energy transition, right? Because some of these technologies do exist, but they're expensive.
Yep. But the question is timing. You know, the more we deploy them, the cheaper they become.
Yes.
I mean, solar panels were, you know, Martin, if you remember years and years ago, in the 90s, I remember lots of panels being developed in German universities, but they were incredibly expensive. But it took, you know, Germany specifically, lots of other countries introduced feed-in tariffs that drove sales. And then ultimately, many years later, Chinese gigafactories that built solar panels, now they're cheap.
Yeah.
So it goes back to the role of incentives. I have found, Pablo, thank you for your message. There's both a chat room and a Q&A, and it's confusing me. So Pablo Ivankovic, another student in my class, and he asks, a lot of the energy transition solutions seem to focus on the industrialized world, but most emissions will continue to come from emerging markets as their populations and economies grow. How can those regions finance the transition, acquire the technology, or worse, what is the incentive to engage in a transition when projects like Belt and Road finances without strings attached?
Well, this is, sorry, Sarah, after you.
I was going to say another A question.
That's good. They're good, aren't they? These. I'm going to have to get you guys to come and teach in Bologna when flights are cheap, available again.
Martin, I don't have an easy answer to this one. This is one of the quintessential difficulties with a global solution to climate change, is how do you finance it in places that can't afford to do it? I think, one of the things that's going to happen is there's going to have to be forms of foreign aid that include, that are climate related. And, we've had that for a long time, even through the World Bank. But it's going to have to be, we're going to have to amp it up much more than what we've had in the past. But then how do you find it? How do you fund that? And I don't know, Martin, do you have a strong opinion on this one?
Nope, I think it's the question. First, before I get into that, I'd just like to haul up Marco for assuming that prices to Bologna will be cheap again, because of course, if we're serious about the energy transition,
I knew you'd do this. I knew.
We should be asking for surcharges on any flights which are not fueled by sustainable aviation fuel, which at the moment is about less than 1% of the consumption of aviation fuel. But anyway, but I think there's a substantive point to that underlying, because it does come back as to how much are we willing to pay for all this stuff, and how much of our lifestyle are we willing to change in the short term. I mean, I think this is a super important question, and I heard actually at Davos at the World Economic Forum a couple of years ago, Ken Rogoff, who is one of the leading economists in the world, professor at Harvard, formerly I think he was chief economist at the IMF or the World Bank, I forget which, and on exactly this question, which is how do you do the energy transition and allow growth in the poorest countries in the world at the same time. And he said this is the most complex international economic question ever. He said, and his point was it's going to need massive transfers of money from one part of the world to another part of the world. It's going to, at the same time as having massive changes in the underlying energy energy technology. And it's a massively complex, multifactorial problem. And it is. And I don't think that if one's honest about it, I don't think that anyone's really got a blueprint. But as I say, to be more optimistic and positive, the good news is we've got sort of 30 or 40 years probably to work out all of the answers. What we've got to do over the next decade is make a good start on some of the answers, right? And I personally think it's better to think about this whole energy transition piece in sort of more manageable, bite-sized pockets, because you've got to start walking down the road and then hope that more of the pieces fall into place down the road.
Yeah, and it gets back to your other point, Martin, which is that how do you have both an energy transition and economic growth, and inexpensive energy for areas that are, that require additional growth. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to do. And I think it's why you and I, who are more in the energy sector, look at this and sort of say, wow, this is a really slow process. It's going to take a lot of different fits and starts, and we'll get there eventually. Whereas folks that are just on the environmental policy side, I think sort of see this as, oh my gosh, this is coming really fast. And it's just not coming fast because of these kinds of issues. I was thinking the other day, Marco, that the vaccine rollout globally is almost a microcosm of climate policy, right?
Yeah.
You have all these different things you're trying to develop. So you've got half a dozen different vaccines developed in different countries, some of them successful, some less successful, some in wealthy countries, some in not. And this sort of, tremendous inequity in how the vaccine rollout is happening. And I have the feeling that, it's going to be the same with climate. We're going to get a lot of things done in the United States and Europe, I think, over the next 10 to 20 years. I think China will do a lot in the next 10 to 20 years, but there's going to be significant parts of the world that just will be much slower moving.
Yeah, I mean, here's the essay question for Pablo, I think, on this one. And, we talked about this a little bit last week, but let me put it to Pablo, and I'd be interested to read his paper on this. But, when we were talking last week, we all know that the single biggest thing which will make an improvement to slowing down carbon emissions is reducing coal in power generation around the world, right? That is the single biggest impact which we can have. So, let's take just the rich countries in the world. Let's take the G7, plus Australia, Canada, a couple of others. Australia is a big coal producer. So, I was throwing out there last week, well, why doesn't the rest of the G7 pay Australia not to produce coal, right? Whatever revenues Australia gets now from coal, so the equivalent amount of money will be paid to them by the rest of the rich countries not to produce the coal, right?
But they're exporting to countries that need it, though.
So there's some really nice things which come out of that, right? We feel good. We've reduced coal in power generation. The price of coal will go up. That will lead to more fuel switching towards gas. This is all great. The only problem is, as Sarah's saying, is that the coal is getting exported to countries like China and India, which actually need the coal for the provision of energy, and where, this massive lifting of people out of poverty has gone on and continues to go on. So the consequences ultimately are felt there, which is, I don't know what the right answer is, and but it's an interesting question. That's why I pose it as an essay question.
So I'd like to add my comments to your comment, Martin, and two comments. The first is, the example of Australia is a good one. Rather than getting Australia pay them to stop producing coal, I think I've seen what could be the germ of a better idea, which is enable Australia to produce vast quantities of renewable energy to then power electrolyzers to then create ammonia. And there is a company actually called Intercontinental Energy with massive ambitions, both in the Middle East and Asia. And they are already signing long-term contracts with utilities. I think it's public, or I'm not going to say which country, not in Asia. And they will be using the ammonia for three things: one, in shipping; two, within their coal-fired boilers; and three, in their gas turbines. And that's green ammonia produced by hydrogen. And given that Australia is very sunny, has massive desert areas, that could be a source of significant wealth to the country. Whether it's on the same scale as coal, I don't know, but it could mitigate some of the costs. So you're creating a benefit, not just mitigating a liability. My second point to the previous question about Pablo's question on alleviation of poverty, I don't see just simply as being transferring capital, wealth, and technologies in order to get some emerging countries to step up to their climate obligations. I see it as a much broader challenge. What we've seen in rural electrification projects is that communities have been isolated from the rest of the world. And by deploying solar technologies, they've been able to connect with the rest of the world. They've been able to not only heat their food, but actually power up their mobile phones. By powering up their mobile phones, they've joined the economic universe. They've been able to have mobile phone accounts. More important than that, they've been able to access education. And with that education in the future, they will become more integrated members of society. And that's a more maybe positive and upbeat message. So it's really enfranchising people who are today disenfranchised, rather than just this sort of view of subsidizing the rich, subsidizing the poor, which I don't think is a nice way of portraying the dynamic. If I may, unless people have more comments, I'd like to ask another couple of questions. So first one from Jamie and then one from Rifat. So this is Jamie Dorner, who says, similar to what we've seen pledged to Central America and on the heels of Earth Day summit today, can we expect any sort of technical or monetary assistance to the larger economies of South America? To be honest, as you pointed that, I've not seen any specific programs, certainly not aimed at Latin America. I know there are lots of programs aimed at Central America, but for the larger economies, they are wealthy economies. And there are access to some of the global funds that are sort of set up in the context of the COP and the various climate discussions, but there are no special allocations of funds to Latin America. I don't know if you want to add to that, otherwise I'll sort of move straight on.
Well, I'll just make one slight comment. I mean, I can't add anything specifically on that, but I think it is worth noting that, if we go back sort of 15 or so years, many of us, I'm sure Sarah's probably included you, we had sort of quite high expectations of what was going on in Latin America. I mean, companies like Petrobras in Brazil or Pemex in Mexico, these were really good companies which were sort of operating at the level of global international businesses. And sadly, most of these big energy companies in Latin America have got sort of destroyed more or less in the last 15 or 20 years. You know, Petrobras is not destroyed, but it's vastly denuded. Pemex is having a lot of problems. Obviously, PDVSA has been completely destroyed. So the amount of the infrastructure and knowledge destruction and expertise which there's been in Latin America in the energy sector in the last decade or so has been dramatic. And that's bound to have a negative impact on any form of development of the energy sector over the next 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, I think the governments of Latin America take a page out of the sort of the bottom-up private sector path, which is ESG, is not just about environment and social practices, it's about governance. And if you don't have governance that is effective, it's going to be very hard even to be a recipient of aid. Because in the same way that financial institutions increasingly want to see governance at corporations, you know, they want to see appropriate governance on both environment and social, you know, practices. So it's going to have to happen, or we're going to take decades to get there.
Thanks, Sarah. We're going to switch gears a bit. So Rifat Musalin, who asks, Chinese solar companies have shown ties to forced labor in Jiangxing. Sarah, you can already know that we're going to ask you about this. To what extent should we balance this drive towards renewable energy with protecting human rights, particularly as it pertains to China? How can the energy community be responsible to find a solution to this issue?
Priorities. It's all about your priorities. And you know, is your priority climate? Is your priority human rights? And my feeling, and this may be controversial, but my feeling is that companies are organized to be profit maximizing. And governments are organized to regulate companies and regulate markets. And I get a little bit frustrated when folks think that energy companies themselves are going to create the environment for, you certainly don't want to make human rights worse or the climate worse, but I'm not sure companies, private sector companies, have that role in China, is to improve the human rights. I think governments do, and governments can put in guidelines or regulations as to how you function overseas, and we have that to some extent for certain, U.S. and European companies. But I don't, when people talk about how can the energy sector do this, I sort of say, well, who is the energy sector in that? Is it who is it?
Yeah.
Who's in charge when you're talking about those kinds of combined goals?
Martin, do you have a perspective on this?
Well, I think Sarah got that one totally. So let me answer a question about China by talking about the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Because that is a country with a huge amount of human rights and civil war issues. And it also happens to be where about, I think it's 70% of the world's supply of cobalt is mined and exported from. And cobalt is absolutely integral to battery technology. I'm sure, Marco, you know the technology much better than me. And so we very quickly come slap bang into the conflict between, Elon Musk's aspirations and the reality of where those batteries are going to come from. Mm-hmm. And the DRC, my recommendation to every student here is you want to guarantee yourself a job in the energy sector over the next 20 years is become intimately familiar with the politics of the DRC because it's going to be right in the middle of it. At the moment, there's no escaping that. If we think batteries and battery technology are central to this, then the DRC is going to be central to it. And it's a very challenged country in many respects. So exactly this question is going to be coming up in one form or another repeatedly. Don't know, Sarah, whether you've anything to add.
And we have a follow-up question, which is a bit out of order. And Sneha, please, apologies, 1 second. There's a question from Alexis Keys, and it's relating to cobalt. Do extractive industries mining for raw materials such as cobalt, lithium, iron in the global south function more equitably, more sustainably than the incumbent fossil fuel industries? What policies or strategies could be employed, national or multilateral, to embed justice into this portion of the transition to clean energy with regard to the exponential growth expansion driven by the massive demand for these products in the global economy?
It looks like she got hold of your final exam, Marco.
Look, I avoid final exams, that's, I've never liked final exams. She's not a student, actually, but it's a very good question. I might have to steal that question.
I mean, I think there's lots of, or increasing number of moves in the existing consumers of all sorts of raw materials, but particularly in the metals industry, to start tracing the origin of different components of the finished product. And I suspect that that's going to be pretty important movement in certain commodities. So I'm a big believer that transparency is important over the medium term, and it tends to be more important than we realize. So I don't think that we shouldn't be naive that just sort of identifying that cobalt is coming from child labor in the DRC is going to mean that it's not going to be produced. It probably will get produced, and it probably will get smuggled out, and it will probably end up in the system in indirect ways. But I think standard setting is important, and I think that putting that pressure on is important, and pushing it backwards. And I think over time that does have an impact, and I think we've seen that if one thinks of in the lifetime of our careers, if one thinks about what mining projects were like in places like Peru 30 years ago, where people around the villages were literally getting poisoned by the emissions from smelters in Peru and elsewhere. And I don't know why I keep saying Peru, there are a number of other countries where this was the case. And over time, the standards have got, and the transparency has pushed standards up around the world. So I think to insist on those types of reporting and standards is a very worthwhile exercise.
Can I maybe add, just before, it's not a very important point, but maybe the whole sort of supply chain reporting on emissions, supply chain quality assurance processes, and knowing where you are sourcing your materials from. If you embed that within the process, then that becomes the natural way of doing things. Questions are then asked, and that puts commercial pressure on the suppliers to meet those rules. So it's maybe not a dramatic way of doing things, but a more business as usual type of approach.
Yes, and I think I'd add one thing more to that, which is price is always a super effective signal, right? So if you can't demonstrate, let's say, the origin of the raw materials of, whatever it is, a battery in which comes into a car which is sold in, let's say, Europe or the US, if you can't demonstrate the origin, well, maybe it will be banned, or the price is going to be higher, right? And people have then got to be willing to pay a price for unguaranteed origin cobalt, for example.
Or even scarier, beyond that, maybe you won't be able to integrate the component into your overall system, because it'll have a chip that if the chip doesn't clear the origin and the carbon, it will not function. So you could even get to that level of sort of manufacturing constraint. That's a possibility.
Good idea. Yeah.
Sarah, sorry.
I just want to underscore something Martin said about transparency. I think this is absolutely critical. And if you look at the oil sector, We have tremendous transparency in the oil sector. Companies like Martin's, Platts has created enormous transparency in price discovery. You also have transparency because the IEA, publishes all the OECD data at a fairly reasonable price. You have the Joint Oil Data Initiative. You have, lots of other sources, companies like mine, that are out there publishing data. And then you look at the trade data. I mean, we track trade data in enormous detail. And I mean, this is one of those things where trade, there should be an NAIS number for lithium. There should be one for cobalt. We should be able to use the international trade data to sort of see who's buying what and where, and there should be some price discovery for data transparency. If you shine that light, organizations all over the world will be critiquing and pointing out areas where there's some perhaps malevolent behavior. And so I think that is absolutely the key item. The other point I wanted to make, and this is something that I'm really amazed when I go to events, how little this is brought up. But lithium, as an example, after you put it in a car, and that car, let's say you have a car that lasts 15 years. It's a really good car. Let's say a Prius or something like that. And then you take that car out. It has lost some of its abilities, the lithium. They say something like 20% of its capabilities for storing a charge are gone permanently. So the question then is, what do you do with that battery afterwards, or the lithium in that battery? You go to recycling, you begin to take it apart, you take all the pieces and the components, and then some people say, well, take the lithium, stick it in big stacks, and put it outside a
utility scale.
Exactly, to power or to store electricity for a building. But the problem is this is going to go on and on and on, and these lithium components do diminish over time. What are we going to do with them? Are we going to dispose of them at some point? And I just keep wondering, how are we going to dispose of spent metals like this? I just don't think we're going to successfully use them over and over and over and over. And when we start talking about 2050, there's going to be a lot of lithium that we're going to be sort of saying, well, what do we do with this stuff? And is it really efficient if it has been diminished in its ability to store a charge? And then no one ever talks about that.
I completely agree. I would only say sort of one little story to end this, to say that the reason why we use lithium-ion batteries is because they were used in mobile phones, and they had a specific use. They had to be light and small, and that was the best technology for that use. And there is no better technology today. If, taking your example, Sarah, you then look at utility scale storage, that's a different kettle of fish. Now, yes, we do use spent batteries, second-hand car batteries, because they're cheap. And yes, we even use new lithium-ion batteries, but they're from a technological perspective, they're not the best in class. They're much better technology, but they've been through that sort of life cycle, deployment cycle, technology, and the prices have come down. There are better technologies. They just haven't been invested in yet. And it's just a matter of waiting. So there are, new technologies waiting, and they're not particularly, new. I mean, they've been in existence, but the prices are still too high. I'm just looking at this clock, and I'm thinking that we're probably coming towards the end of our session. I maybe want to ask one more question from my student, Sneha Mahapatra, and she's asked two, which is quite cheeky. So I'll just take her last question, which I think is a nice SAIS question. And her last question, which is the last question of the panel, is: given the current geopolitical landscape with the rise in authoritarian governments and democratic backsliding, do you see this transition leading to uprisings, conflicts, and proxy wars in the near and foreseeable future? That's a good question to finish on.
That's a big one. I think climate, as I said before, it is geopolitics, right? And there's going to be disagreement. Now, whether can you get into a war over climate? I'm not sure directly you can, but perhaps indirectly you can. I don't know. It's a difficult question. I haven't really thought about that.
Martin, do you have maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much a possibility, and I think that that ultimately, as Sarah says, climate is geopolitics. It's as we've been talking about. It's going to be a battle for resources. It's going to be about choices between provision of energy and different ways of provision of energy and meeting economic needs of populations. And those are really hard trade-offs. And the likelihood is, as Sarah, I think her analogy with the vaccine rollout is a really good one, right? And that's been highly contentious. So one can only imagine that the battle over resources in climate change over a 30-year period is going to be contentious as well. So I think that is a possibility. Natural resources have often given rise to conflict, and as we speak, there are conflicts all over the world which are about struggles for natural resources. So I think there's absolutely every possibility. Yeah.
Kimmy, let me just add one more comment on that, because I have thought about it this way too, and I don't know if this is a legitimate statement or not, but I sometimes think renewable electricity is kind of like a locavore market, right? So if I have renewable electricity here in Boston, it's going to probably come from an offshore wind farm that's probably within 50 miles of my home, right? It's not going to come from Western United States. It's probably not going to come across the Atlantic. And I just kind of wonder if there's a lot of people who believe to get to an energy transition, you have to increase the amount of electricity that in the energy mix. That you're beginning, you chip away at coal, then you chip away at oil, and maybe even chip away at gas. And your electricity, which will increasingly be made from nuclear, renewables, and gas. And electricity really is local. I mean, really long distance transmission lines, unless they're DC lines, they don't carry very well. So I kind of sort of think of it a little bit like the locavore food business, that we may actually end up having less international trade in energy and fewer ships at sea carrying coal or LNG or oil. I mean, maybe the transition could actually bring about a little bit of stability on the energy front. I don't know. Just a thought.
And I appreciate and agree with that thought. A lot of technologies are all about decentralized solutions. Whether that has a massive impact, as you say, on the global trade, we'll yet to see. But with that incisive and insightful comment, I'd like to end the panel. I'd like to thank Sarah. I'd like to thank Martin. It's been a really, really interesting, stimulating discussion. We've talked about many things. Certainly geopolitics, certainly the transition, certainly supporting fossil fuels and incentivizing students to not forget that there are huge industries out there that need their talents. And hopefully we'll continue the debate next year. I'd also like to thank Mike Plummer and his team for making this panel possible, and also to James Anderson, who supported the panel. And hopefully see you all next year. Certainly for my students, I'll see you next week. Please get some sleep in, because next week is the simulation, which means no sleep. Thank you again, and hope to see you all very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Marco.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.